Hello, and welcome to Campus Guard's webinar, Decentralized and Vulnerable, Why Higher Ed is the Perfect Target for Modern E-Skimming. My name is Kathy Staples. I'm the marketing manager here at Campus Guard. We are recording today's session, so look for an email with a link to the recording in the next day or two. If you do have any questions, please enter them into the chat and we'll answer as many as we can following the presentation. We do want your feedback about today's content, so please complete our brief survey after the session has ended. Today, we're exploring modern e-skimming attacks, why higher education is a prime target, how these attacks are evolving to bypass traditional controls, and what institutions should expect in 2026. Let's get started by introducing today's presenter. Steve Ward is a CMO of Source Defense. He brings nearly 30 years of experience in IT and cybersecurity, with pivotal roles in shaping areas such as network forensics, endpoint security, threat intelligence, cyber risk quantification, automation, and client-side security. He was deeply involved with PCI DSS since its earliest development and offers a unique long-term perspective on the evolution of security and compliance standards critical to the payments and PCI community. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I appreciate it. And thank you guys for joining us today. We're going to be talking pretty deeply about e-skimming and all the things that you specifically as stewards of data and security in your higher ed institutions really need to be considering. I will be talking through some fairly high level technical details on a number of things. If I get a little too into the weeds and it flies over the head, don't worry. We can always explain a little bit deeper in the Q&A if you need it, or we can always follow up, post session to explain things a little bit more. I know e-skimming is not necessarily everyone's, sort of deepest subject matter. We're here to help you understand the problem, shed light on what you need to do, and really understand sort of like where your organizations, face risk. So happy to be partnering with Campus Guard in this regard, and we'll dive in without further ado. On the takeaway side of things, I want to talk a bit about the unique situation that you face in higher ed and how your sort of diverse infrastructure really makes you a prime target for cybercrime adversaries, seeking to steal data and card data in particular. I want to talk a bit about what's happening in the e-skimming world, how these attacks are proliferating, how they're gaining sophistication. There's some alarming trends that have been undertaken over the course of the last year or so that I think everyone needs to know about, especially as it relates to considering where you are against PCI DSS and some of the guidance underneath that framework. We'll talk about how attacks are evolving to evade controls. As I'm sure you've experienced in your careers, cyber adversaries, they do not stand still. They're constantly responding, reacting, and moving to get beyond our capabilities as the good guys. I want to talk a bit about, and this is somewhat of a controversial subject, how some of the current focus on compliance is creating somewhat of a false sense of security. We'll talk about other forms of data theft, specifically those that you should be concerned with, given the data that you are stewards of outside of card data, and then a little bit about why these attacks somewhat map to or match APT style or advanced persistent threat style attack vectors and attack techniques that had traditionally been reserved for nation state actors, but now we're seeing more and more in the cybercrime realm. On this briefing, sort of where you take it away, how to use it. We will focus a bit on real world attack vectors and real world threats. This will be data that comes specifically from the research that we conducted throughout 2025. And I'll give a little bit of background on Source Defense in a minute, and you'll understand where we get this level of visibility. We'll go into some technicals. I'll try and keep it high level so it doesn't go too far into the weeds as to just go over anyone's head. It won't be sort of a one-on-one session. I'm going to assume that everybody's got a baseline familiarity. I'll touch a little bit, on the requirements under PCI DSS and things of that nature, but I'm really going to dig a little deeper into, what's going on in this world, than maybe sort of like an introductory format. And then I want it to be interactive. We want it to be interactive. And so, as Kathy said, if you have questions, enter them into chat. We'll definitely address on the back end of this call anything that's asked. And should you not have the ability to get a question answered, we can do follow up in a one-on-one capacity. Okay. So Source Defense, who we are a partner with Campus Guard. We are the pioneer in e-skimming security. This is sort of like the core focal point that we have had as an organization for the better part of the last 10 years. We are also a strategic partner with MasterCard underneath the MasterCard Start Path program. And so we have direct, relationships with the card associations, specifically with the largest in the world with MasterCard. We have a lot of other relationships throughout the payments ecosystem that informs our purview and that gives us the ability, I think, to really speak with authority on these subjects. And so, we'll uncover that a little bit as we go along. But ultimately, what we're all about is protecting data in this new realm, which is at the point of input. If you're familiar with, security sort of thinking, and specifically around, PCI DSS, the notion had always been around protecting data in transit, as it's going across the network, protecting data at rest as it resides in the databases where, adversaries seek to steal, data in mass. There's a new attack vector, and there's a new point of protection that we need to focus on, and that is, at the point of capture, as it's actually being entered into the forms that power your online interactions, whether they be with students or with parents, or with donors or any number of constituents that you might have. It's ultimately where the attack vector has shifted and where the bad guys are focused most, because of the defenses that it put in place around in transit and around at rest. So it's ultimately, point of capture is the battleground. We're all about protecting data at the point of capture, rounding out web security, really ultimately enabling third-party service integration into your websites, helping you address a third-party risk that really has been flying underneath sort of the overall TPRM radar. And it is our background and our solution and our capabilities that powers the Campus Guard approach to the problem. And so we're happy to be partnering with them. And so we bring expertise to the table in, sort of the security landscape and the e-skimming world, and they deliver the expertise specific to your domain, and all the track record they have, in higher ed. There is data security, and that's largely what I'm going to be talking about. That is, the focal point of the conversation here. But there's also a data privacy element that you need to understand, and I'll touch on that as we go throughout, the conversation. It's not just about data being stolen; it's also about data inadvertently being shared with your third-party supply chain on your website. And ultimately, that jeopardizes compliance across not just PCI, but other forms of data privacy mandated compliance like HIPAA, FFIEC, GDPR, things of that nature. And we'll touch on that as we go along. So it's not just PCI, but it very much is PCI we'll talk about today. There are other things this touches on in terms of data privacy, as I just mentioned. You should know that we are tied at the hip to the PCI Council. And that's another part in addition to our work with card brands like MasterCard. We are what's called a PCI PPO, which means we're a principal participating organization. We are heavily engaged in the shaping of the standard. We're a PCI compliant solution, and by default, the solution that Campus Guard brings forward is as well. And I myself sit on the PCI board of advisors. And so we are, in the room, having the conversations, understanding what's going on with the evolution of the standard, helping shape things, providing our feedback. And in the case of some of the stuff that I'm going to present today, speaking truth to power and, not being afraid of saying we're taking good strides and good things are happening, but there are gaps that still need to be filled. And here's what they are. And so I will highlight some of that for you as we go along. So protecting data at the point of input and e-skimming and what the heck is this all about, right? Ultimately, what you need to understand is this. When you consider your websites, right, and the microsites that power your organization, they aren't yours per se. And what do I mean by that? It used to be that in the early days, all the code was written by the website owner, right? Or the majority of it was written by the website owner. And it was, what we refer to in the industry as first party code, stuff you developed, your coders wrote, your AppSec team and your development team, could vet and understand where vulnerabilities might exist. Now it's completely shifted. The modern website, really is like a hodgepodge of services that are called in from what we refer to as like a digital supply chain. 82% of the code on the modern website isn't code written by the website owner. So, Steve Ward, .edu, right? You would expect that, I would have things, on that site that are called in from any number of different partners. It could be analytics like Google Analytics. It could be tag managers like Adobe or Google Tag Manager. It could be social connections like the Metapixel or your links out into the various different social platforms, ad tech, payment providers, all sorts of various different vendors coming in and supplying this code, this third party code, which largely is unmanaged, largely is unvetted, and uncontrolled, and as a result, creates this really feature rich attack surface for the adversary. It's for the most part all JavaScript, and JavaScript is a very, very powerful language. It allows, effectively, control of the website to do anything, that it wants to do. It can read, it can write, it can change. And so what makes things, sort of dangerous, is that, if we're not managing these things and we're not keeping control over and monitoring what's happening and sort of like, enforcing behavioral framework over top of it, we could have JavaScript that is compromised that can change your page content, and so that could mean adding requests for form data or for PII or PHI or other forms of privacy data, where you wouldn't necessarily be asking for it. They can change the actual flow of the site, adding text, adding video, adding form fields, creating false buttons that take users beyond what you intended to be into domains controlled by the adversary. They can record keystrokes and exfiltrate data. And that's really in where the e-skimming sort of framework and the concept behind the thought comes into play. Skimming data from the keystrokes as they're being entered into the forms, grabbing that data and redirecting it to an adversary's control, and then allowing them to do various different forms of nefarious activity with it. It could be stolen card data used for fraudulent transactions. It could be stolen credentials data used for further downstream attacks. It can be stolen PHI or other forms of PII, used for either identity theft or even blackmail. There's bad things that can happen when you aren't managing this content. It should also be noted, and this is where I'll sort of like put the little pin on the data privacy side of things, is that even when an adversary is not present and there's not an attack underway, your third parties are doing this. And the scripts as written, they're very powerful. The marketing scripts and analytics and tracking capabilities, all these things that sort of like enrich the marketing intelligence and how better communicate, with your constituents. Those are things that jeopardize the privacy controlled data as well. And so there's many examples just in the last year or two where I'll give you a great example. The Metapixel was deployed on a healthcare or a series of healthcare websites where, as patient data was being entered and, interactions of a sensitive nature. I have this condition. Here's my insurance information, things of that nature. The Metapixel was actually scraping and reading that. And then, consumers were going to Instagram and Facebook, and they were seeing ads fed back to themselves around their health condition. And it red alert, like, how do you know that? This is private information. And so you have to control the script, regardless of whether or not, and irrespective of whether or not there's an attack underway, because not controlling it gives, sort of inadvertent data leakage capability, to your third parties, which puts you in jeopardy, right? So you want to control it regardless of whether or not you feel like you're going to be under attack, because there's too much power, behind these scripts. In your world and, in the environments that you manage, there are so many touch points. So I'm not a higher education expert. I have put three children through college. I have two in college right now. And I will tell you that I do know there are a lot of ways to interact, and in more and more, increasingly every semester, it seems like there's a new system, a new platform that I've got to somehow interact with or get permission from them to interact with. But you kind of know your environment, right? There's tuition and fees that you guys are collecting. There's the online bookstore. There's athletic events and other event ticketing. There's donation platforms, for alumni and for other capabilities. You've got department level microsites. In some cases, you may run a hospital network or you have insurance services. These are all areas where adversaries, want a bite at the apple, and they're all, generally online, and they're all gathering and collecting, various different bits of information that are attractive. And so it's this sort of attack surface that creates these multiple attack points. And in some cases, based on our experience, what we see is decentralized management. The people that manage, the athletic and the event side of things don't interact or know what's going on with tuition and payments, and vice versa. Many cooks, multiple kitchens, multiple points of weakness, and that's what these guys really love is a feature-rich or a target-rich environment where there's low likelihood that the left hand and the right hand are going to be able to detect what's going on, especially against the backdrop of what we hear in higher ed, which is you've got obviously budget pressures and resource pressures that keep you from sort of like having that full staff that like an enterprise merchant might have, right? What is important for you to understand is that at least as it relates to PCI DSS, there's now a requirement for you to do something about this. And that stems from, years of understanding at the card brand level. It's one of the reasons MasterCard has partnered with us. Visa has done a bunch of research on the subject as well. Years of understanding it. This has become a primary form of fraud in the payments ecosystem. And so a couple of years ago, when PCI DSS 4.0 was released, they introduced for the first time a requirement around, e-skimming control or, better e-commerce security is kind of what you can think of it as. And these requirements are labeled number 643 and 1161. They are mandated. They were for a couple of years best practices, and we're at the 1 year mark now, where these controls must be in place in order for you to be PCI compliant. So if you've not put something in place, you are not compliant, and you jeopardize yourselves in the terms of fines and judgments. In terms of even at the card brand level, they can cut off your ability to process payments. And that's where we partnered, with Campus Guard and the offering that they have, which is ScriptSafe, to really help deliver like an automated form of protection, to this problem. That's prevention first, that takes care of all the elements and then some. And so, when you look at 643 and 1161, what they're telling you got to do is get a handle on the problem. Understand what your ecosystem looks like. So you need to know who your script partners are, know who these third-party partners are in your digital supply chain. You have to maintain an inventory of them. You have to confirm that they're supposed to be there. And that might seem illogical, like, well, why would they be there if we didn't want them there? There's so much dated infrastructure, so many services, where one marketing regime or one web, sort of authority had moved on, and the next person coming in didn't clean things up, and so there's end of life, non-supported, non-patched scripts that you'll find all over the place in your environment. So got to check, know it's there, authorize that it needs to be there, and then you have to get into the protection side of things. You have to monitor and assure the integrity of the script, that it hasn't been compromised, and you need to look at the payment page header at least every 7 days, and then you need to be in a position to alert and respond to all scripts that might be found on your page to be malicious. Where ScriptSafe comes in is there are capabilities for detect and alert, but ultimately, what most people want to do is sort of press the set it and forget it button. And the set it and forget it button means automated prevention, behavioral based control, stopping an attack before it occurs. giving you all of the other requirements, and in a lot of cases, using automation to streamline the process. So automatic identification of new scripts, automatic justification and definitions of these scripts, et cetera. But ultimately, that's one of the capabilities in ScriptSafe is just cut it off at the pass. Or if you've got a really robust security operation and you want to take alerts and feed them into that, you can in a detection only kind of capability. But so you got to do this stuff. If you haven't done this stuff, you're not compliant. But more important than compliance, you're at risk. And that's really where the heart of the rest of the conversation comes into play, helping you understand what's really going on in this world of e-skimming with a look back at 2025 and the advancements that have been made in the threat world and the changing and shifting what we call TTPs, techniques, tactics, and procedures that the adversaries are using. What I will say is 2025 was a year of proliferation. We saw tens of thousands of e-commerce sites attacked all around the world, globally across all verticals. Higher ed featured in that, pretty significantly. Fashion and apparel, travel and leisure, transport, media, even government services. Most usually in the state and local, where municipalities are grabbing, parking ticket information, or you're paying your property tax, things of that nature. More so than in the federal world, where controls and security investment is much higher. But what we're seeing is one-to-many attacks versus sort of targeted whales. And what I mean by that is it's the big brands getting breached that make the headlines, right? Everybody takes note when pick your favorite brand. There was one number of years ago. My wife shops there. The joke is you can't get out of the shop. I'm not going to beat up the brand, but you can't get out of there without spending $150. I think some of you might know who that is. That everyone is shocked, right? Because it's big brand. Everyone knows. We all interface with. The bad guys like those because they can get a lot of stuff stolen at once, but they also and more increasingly like sort of hitting the little guys or using a trolling net instead of a spearfish to try and get after as many sites as possible. And what they do is they compromise very specific, highly utilized services, to get there. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But we saw, this is just through our view, nearly 100 distinct campaigns. And this means, distinct actors, distinct techniques, launched, from all over the world. And so, if there's that many, you can imagine, how many we don't see, because our detection net is not, all encompassing. But that's a lot. It's a lot of campaigns. We saw, in those campaigns, an increasingly aggressive use of, targeting the trusted relationship with things as important as like Google Tag Manager. We saw Google Tag Manager compromised in 30 plus instances throughout those campaigns. And alarmingly, right at the end of the year, we discovered a campaign that is using what we refer to as like a modular attack infrastructure, which seems to indicate and signal, an advancing of the capabilities. More than just sort of like this isn't somebody doing this in their basement, a script kiddie kind of thing. This is building attacks as a service. And this is building a real, sort of infrastructure that indicates, much heavier sophistication and likely, organized criminal activity. In one campaign alone, we saw 1,000 sites attacked. It's industrial scale. It's across the entire site, and I want to make sure that's clear. And I'll dig into that a little bit. The payment page itself is where PCI focuses its attention. That's where the most sensitive data is being captured, at least in the world of card data protection. But the attacker isn't just going after the payment page. They're attacking broadly across the site, and that enables them, to bypass a lot of the controls that people have put in place if they've only focused on the letter of PCI. And it's something, I'll highlight more that you really need to understand. We've seen all sorts of languages targeted. localized attack modules, multiple payment platforms, so no payment platform is immune, and the weaponization of all sorts of legitimate services, as I mentioned in the notes above, like the analytics capabilities, the video capabilities, ad networks, things of that nature. So no one segment's immune. There's no sort of like, our industry is not of interest. It's a wide net, and the bad guys are winning. In fact, some of the work that we've done recently indicates that the adoption rate for security technology here to combat this is so behind that like roughly 95% of the attack surface still remains exposed. And so, again, if you're in that category, I would encourage you and implore you to get moving. Take this off the list and get this threat out of the way. Um, we believe that 4.0.1 it really advanced the cause, but we really believe that there's an illusion of security that's found within it. And so when we talk, at the PCI Board of Advisors level and, with MasterCard and, in our role as, sort of like a good steward in the industry, we're banging the drum pretty loudly to say we've got some problems here. There's a bit of a misunderstanding of the threat that experts in the space have been trying to guide and advise, and the standard hasn't caught up. It needs to, and I'll speak to that. It's a bit too myopic. It's too static of an understanding of what the adversaries are actually doing. As a result, there's misguidance that's happening. There's control references in DSS that I think you should just blatantly ignore. And I'll talk through that as we go along here. There's a sort of a narrow focus that actually needs to be expanded out, not just payment page, but beyond. Some of you, if you're more sophisticated, you might have gone through, what happened last year with the sort of change to what's referred to as the SAC-A. And, PCI came out and they said, well, if you're SAC-A, you don't have to do all the stuff under 643 and 11.6.1. That caused a lot of sort of de-scoping in people's minds. It provided some loopholes, and it created a bit of a shell game, which took the eye off the prize. And so, I'll talk through this stuff here, right? Controls that don't control. Okay, a big issue. If you look at what's going on in the DSS and you popped it open right now, you would see a reference to what's referred to as CSP and SRI, Content Security Policy and Sub-Resource Integrity. Basically, these are controls that exist that, were designed for a world that no longer exists. And it may be where some of like, if you go to your team, they say, oh yeah, we got this thing taken care of because we use CSP and SRI. We've built out effectively an allow list, a white list of what's allowed, a black list of what's not. These are outdated controls, as outdated as the idea of being able to use like signature-based antivirus, to detect, malware in other forms. They cannot track the evolving attacks. There was an entire 80-member, task force that I was part of that was, charged late in 2024, leading to 2025, with providing guidance to the industry. We all warned CSP and SRI need to be removed from the DSS. They had not been. They still exist there today. And so I think if anybody is moving down that pathway, my advice to you, regardless of whether or not you turn to script safe and source defense, would be stop, don't do it, go another direction. CSP is a massive, undertaking. You've got to create effectively an allow list of everything that you want, to be running on the site. Your marketing teams and the people that manage these sites are going to be out there saying, I don't have time for you to wait for your approval process. I'm going to be pushing things. I own the site. I'm going to be pushing it. Creates internal conflict, creates breakage, creates the need for continuous updates. And even if should you continuously update things, it won't matter because it is the trusted services that are being compromised that lead to these attacks. So in a CSP world, you would say, I'm going to allow Google Analytics, or I'm going to allow Google Tag Manager, or I'm going to allow this specific video player. It doesn't look at what's happening with the script. So if you've said this is a trusted partner and the trusted partner is compromised, you've done nothing, right? SRI is a little bit different. SRI is looking at creating hashes or effectively signatures for every script that should be allowed to run. And what you need to understand is that the way scripting works today, specifically at the website level, is it's all dynamic. So there are responses that modify what scripts run, time of day, geography, user interaction, all of those types of things. So it creates this dynamic environment where SRI just basically can't keep up. You can never have a hash created for every possible variation of that script. A great example, one of our clients, they manage 25 e-commerce sites around the world, and they look at something like 47,000 script changes a month in SRI, that would never ever be able to be kept up with. And so, one of the core authors of the DSS has come out and publicly said, I didn't know enough when we were creating this, and I got this wrong. We should change it, but they haven't changed it. So this is misleading. Don't go in that direction. We've got a white paper that Source Defense wrote that Kathy and the team from Campus Guard will follow up with. Sort of looking at behavioral-based approaches versus CSP and SRI. But ultimately, we think this needs to be removed from the conversation, and we think that because of the fact of what we're seeing in the wild. So it is inside the allowed paths and inside the trusted services that the bad guys are finding, their success. Again, 30 plus Google Tag Manager IDs compromised, and I'll get into a little bit about how they use that compromise. Is a dead indication of violating trusted services, as the Trojan horse to get in the network, right, or into your site. Um, I'll talk a little bit about the second side of the bullets, this expanding attack surface, as we get a little deeper. I threw it in here just to bring it up, as a pin. It's not just card data that they want. We're seeing increasingly credential harvesting, PII across, account management flows, the payment data through other injection vectors. But it's the third parties and the fourth parties they want to go after. The trust model is the vector. And so those controls, by simply saying, I trust these parties, are not controls in and of themselves. We're seeing a ton of legitimate abuse. CDN and edge platforms being used, Cloudflare, Fastly, AWS, to host malicious scripts, and then to allow for access into your environment because of the trusted domain reputation. We're seeing developer platforms like GitHub, GitLab, Pastebin, JSFiddle used to hide payloads that appear legitimate. And so when you look at what happens in a lot of cases, and your development teams, they may be going to open source repositories and grabbing, what seems to be legitimate and trusted and peer verified code to run on the website. We're finding more and more compromises, hiding in those repositories. So you got to be careful about that. And then we're seeing, exfiltration endpoints and other, legitimate pathways being, utilized to basically get the data, out and to, hide slow and low, so you don't see that there's any indication of compromise. But the attack of Google Tag Manager and going after Google Tag Manager is alarming. It is, probably the most trusted tag manager, in utilization right now. We saw it in roughly 33%, of the documented attacks in 2025. It gives the bad guy centralized control. They can have a single point for ejecting malicious code across, every page on your site, not just your payment page. It allows for rapid deployment, propagating immediately without developer involvement. Google Tag Manager and Tag Managers in general are used as codeless deployment capabilities for marketing teams, drag and drop scripting, right? That, doesn't require, complex development. It's there, we trust it, we put it in place. And so, that trust is a problem, and it allows for, broad deployment, maybe across all your microsites. Obviously, coming from Google's infrastructure, many security filters won't flag it. And then there's the ability for adversaries to hide in a nested doll, Russian doll kind of way, containers within containers that create layered attack opportunities, and even opportunities for them to have anti-remediation capabilities built in, so that if they are detected, and they notice that detection, they can take steps, to go and hide or to reload themselves in the attack path. And so we saw in one case, an attack pathway where a legitimate container was utilized. The initial trusted container basically loads normally. It would not have flagged anything. But then once that container opens up, another call is made to a compromised container, which basically brings in the malicious payload, and then a final container opens it and delivers the skimming code. And so, this is a case where, very trusted service. CSP would have said, yep, anything that Google Tag Manager loads, I'm going to allow it to load. And you've got the bad guys basically using that knowledge to hide themselves and make this, possible. And so bypassing, controls that had good intent, but don't really, live up in real world kind of example. I got about 10 minutes. I'm gonna get through here, I promise, because I want to make sure we get questions answered. But basically, it should hammer home. And there's way more detail, in the 2025 report that we'll make available that, you got, it's the trusted services, it's the big names that are being hit to basically, enable these types of attacks. The scoping side of things is an issue, and that's something where I would say if you have not taken steps to move forward, and you're looking at DSS, don't just resolve your scope down to payment pages. E-skimming occurs site-wide. It does not occur just on payment pages. Real-world attacks are compromising all of these scripts that run everywhere else on the website. Okay, we did research with Verizon for the Verizon 2024 Payment Security Report, and we looked at 7,000, of the world's largest websites. We found hundreds of thousands of scripts running. We found a majority running in a non-payment page environment. So, the like upstream parent page, you might hear it referred to as. We found plenty running on payment pages, with many accessing PII and credentials data and things of that nature. That in and of itself is bad. But the fact that the scripts exist site-wide, and what we talked about earlier with, a compromised script and what can happen, gives the adversary the ability to compromise your site regardless of whether or not you got the payment page protected. So you need to be thinking about site-wide protection, not just payment page protection. And the financial investment is nominal between the two. It really is like insignificant to a point where it makes no sense to just isolate your view down to that single attack surface. Go site-wide, protect upstream, because even Visa and their 2024 report was saying compromises are happening on the non-payment infrastructure. I would caution you that iframes, and the use of embedded iframes, or even if you in your environment are fully outsourcing the payment page as a complete redirect, somebody clicks on checkout and checkout goes outside and you're not controlling the payment infrastructure, you may not be technically in scope as it relates to what's outlined in the DSS, but you are still at risk. And regardless of whether or not you're compliant with PCI, if a breach happens, you're the one at fault. The consumer or your broad, base of constituents are going to hold you at fault, and you're the one who's going to suffer the fines. You're the one who's going to suffer the cost. Simply embedding an iframe doesn't stop upstream compromise, and simply outsourcing to a full redirect doesn't stop upstream compromise. And so we need to shift our thinking from just payment page protection to site-wide JavaScript governance. And the evidence couldn't be more clear. This is not our data. This is Security Metrics, who they are a QSA, qualified security auditor, as well as a PFI, a forensic investigator. And they did, 2,000 forensic investigations involving e-skimming. And in March of last year, basically came out and said in 100% of the cases, the failure was present on the referring page, not because of malicious script on the payment page. Okay. And so, if you are managing a website and you're running third-party scripts and you take any data and you take card data, you got to think site-wide, because the bad guy can hijack a script and basically reconfigure the checkout flow. And that's what we see in this method that's detailed in 2025. We call it the pizza method. Basically, it's injecting a new payment option into the website UI. Okay. The malicious script comes, it runs, and it basically takes control over the checkout button. Okay. It looks like a legitimate payment flow. And increasingly, what the adversary will do is they will mirror image legitimate payment sites and maybe even the payment processor that you work with in a near pixel perfect kind of way so that there's no alarm that goes off to the consumer because most of these attacks because the infrastructure is not in place and people haven't put security in place. Most of these attacks are actually consumer flagged. Something's wrong on your site, or that didn't look legitimate. So they're like using pixel perfect, kind of mirror imaging of what your legitimate payment flow would look like. When the user clicks on the button, they're redirected to an attacker controlled payment gateway that looks exactly like the legitimate side of things. They capture all the detail, including CVV. It's a real convincing checkout experience and then redirect back to your site where the payment failed error so that you force the payment again so that the consumer doesn't flag to you that something's wrong. I can't process my tuition payment, whatever the case may be. And I think I made a $17,000 tuition payment, online, maybe 2, 3 months ago. In this case, they could have taken, all $17,000 and my card data and all that kind of stuff, right? So it's about protecting the site, not just about protecting the page, because if I weaponize the site, I can change the payment flow. Another thing that we see in the skimming world is no pop-ups, no overlay, no obvious form manipulation, no visible signs of a fake form. They actually intercept form submissions via event listeners. And then, that way, what they're also doing is not trying to skim everything. It's why we call it skimming, right? Not trying to take every single transaction that you have that your consumers interact with. They're going round robin. You don't want a bunch of people flagged out for fraud. So they might do every 10th transaction or every 20th transaction. We see that a lot. And they're doing things like storing captured data in cookies or local storage so that they can exfiltrate the data later. So there's no real trace or detection of communication with known command and control or blacklisted domains, right? So we see that a lot. And then there's this other, side of things where it's overlaying legitimate forms and legitimate flows where it, again mimics the legitimate payment page. This one requires like a dual capture. It's a little bit noisier, and so we're seeing less and less of this. Where it requires the consumer to enter the data twice. That tends to flag off and get people kind of raising their hand. But definitely think that the scope has got to be broader than just the sort of payment page itself, based on everything that we're seeing. And then, gets into, SAC A, and I'm going to cut it off here in about 2 seconds or 2 minutes so we can leave time for questions. But the SAC A thing, if you're familiar at all with this, you'll understand what I'm talking about. If not, I'll give you a little bit of background. The way PCI DSS manages, what your scope is, depends on how you report, right? If you're working at a level one, capability, you're using QSA to, go and do your audit. And so you've got an attestation of compliance or a report on compliance that you need to, deliver with a QSA. If you're a little lower than that in terms of transaction volume, you can fill out what's called a self-assessment questionnaire. And there's multiple forms of self-assessment questionnaires based on how you, the parameters or requirements underneath that reporting mechanism. There's one called SAC A, which a lot of people, not just small merchants, but so many of you on this call, and even large, like big brand, big box retailers use specific to their e-commerce environment. SAC A basically allows you to, provide a self-assessment. And a couple of months before, this was the 643 and 1161, the e-skimming controls were supposed to be put in place. They made some changes to SAC A to try and make the world easier for the small merchant. And it got really muddy and it got really bad. They said, well, no, maybe you don't have to do 643 and 11.6.1. But then they came back about a month later and said, well, maybe you do. And it created all this confusion and it created all this, sort of like paralyzing effect inside the industry. End of the day, here's my advice to you. Compliance is supposed to be there as a floor, not a ceiling. And the any of these compliance frameworks, whether it's PCI DSS or pick another, they're always reactive and responsive, and so they're usually lagging against what the capabilities of an adversary are. Yes, you don't want to take and undertake, a tremendous amount of expense and complexity inside your environment if you're not necessarily feeling the pain every day, or if you're not mandated to do so. That said, without controls and management and monitoring in place, you'll have no idea whether or not this is something that you're confronted with because you're not managing it. You can only manage what you monitor, right? The expense here and the investment here is nominal. This is not, your father's Oldsmobile, right? As they used to say, this is not like some, enterprise-wide, massively disruptive deployment of a solution that's going to require, new teams and task force and just investment and budget approval. And, this isn't that, right? This is a pointed solution to, a pronounced problem, which, is incredibly affordable, which has been designed with set it and forget it kind of capabilities that can cover this attack surface for you virtually overnight. And it's just something you should do. I sort of get on my security soapbox. I've been in security for 26 years now. Do it because it's the right thing to do, not because the mandate tells you you must do it. And so, you may look at it and say, well, we don't think we're in scope, or we outsource, completely to the payment service provider, or my PSP is telling me they got this covered, or, whatever. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's your organization, the university you serve, or the network of universities you serve, that you really need to be thinking about, and it's consumers and students, and so do something. Don't play the shell game, right? So I haven't had a sip of water in like minutes and minutes and minutes, and I know Kathy wanted me to leave enough time for Q&A, so I think we're at that point. I'll just leave you with a couple of things. On the look ahead, like we're keeping our finger on the pulse here. We think things are only going to get worse. We expect to see more modular operations, more as a service, which means more people coming into this game, which means more attacks happening. So, the bullseye is getting bigger, right? We expect, based on what we're seeing with the aggressiveness around things like attacking Google Tag Manager, that you'll see increased supply chain targeting. And so, like every one of your partners represents a potential weakness. We think we'll see more adaptive campaigns and form manipulation overlays that are responding to user behavior, maybe even following your users, across your particular complex environment. And we see more of a focus on credential and identity theft as a component of these attacks, not just card data. And that gets into other areas of data privacy concern that you might have, or other forms of data that you manage. So with that, Kathy, I'm going to shut up and we'll take questions. But I thank you guys, for listening thus far, and happy to answer anything that might have come through.
Oh, great. We have a few questions here. Get some water, Steve. Um, First one here, can you talk about specific attacks you've seen in higher ed?
Yeah, so I won't go into anything as it relates to, talking about a victim, right? We don't want to ever do that, because it's not, no victim shaming and no exposure of who's there. What I will tell you is, we've seen a number of attacks, in the recent past, related to higher ed in particular, with some of the techniques that were described in the 2025 report. That's why I mentioned, sort of like of the industries that we've seen, higher ed was among them. And I will say that what we always do if we detect an attack is we inform, the owners of the property, hey, there's something underway. Generally, what'll happen is it'll kick in a PFI investigation, and that means pressure from the card brands, to get something done. And we're seeing that happening with increasing fervor from the part of Mastercard and other partners in the space. So they're paying attention to this, and it's more disruptive, to respond to these things than it is to get in front of them. And so I would say, we're seeing that, shaking up the EDU world a little bit recently.
Okay, great. Another person wrote, we're not compliant yet with the requirements under 6.4.3 and 11.6.1. How hard is this to tackle, and how long does it typically take?
It really is a matter of like you can have this taken care of virtually overnight. The way that ScriptSafe is designed and sort of the underlying engine behind it, is It's a sort of a low code deployment if you go for the full prevention solution. A couple of lines of code, that you drop in, to the website. And so that's, really like can happen in hours, if not sooner. And the ongoing management side of it is designed such that you're not having to like dedicate a lot of hours to this, even on a monthly basis. So it can move really fast. We have like a 30-day action plan, from POV or POC, all the way to deployment. You can get it up and down in 30 days. We can actually move faster than that. I'd say the longest, part of that process is internal approval on the client end. We've had people deploy this inside 24 hours. And it's done, and they don't have to worry about it. So the delay, really is not advisable.
Absolutely. Somebody else wrote, in higher ed, we're typically budget and resource constrained, which we've all heard. How much of an
Yeah.
investment? How much of an
Um,
investment is this
yeah,
going to
there's
be?
some scoping that you have to do, and I'd leave that for a conversation between you guys and Campus Guard on it. What I would say is, and I've said it a couple times throughout the presentation, is that like this isn't some massive investment that is going to shake you to the core, fall back in your chair, sticker shocky, kind of way. It's really fairly nominal, and so we rarely see the investment as much of a barrier to getting the protection in place. So it depends on your environment, but I would anticipate, it's something you could look at, and you could look at it as a very palatable investment that can happen, without like special budget approval for the year.
Great. And going back to your discussion on CSP and SRI, are you suggesting that a focus on CSP and SRI should be abandoned?
Yep, absolutely. And I don't have any problem saying that. I think it's a fool's errand to think that you can go down that pathway and stop this threat. And then it leads to the question, well, it says, okay, well, then why are they there and why do I need to manage them? And I would say you don't, not with something like script safe in place. I think that what we also see, and this is some recent research that we'll share with you guys in the near term, but we did another analysis of the outside world, and we've seen in a lot of the cases, like overwhelming majority, like 90% of the 90% of the cases where we found CSP to be deployed, it's misdeployed. So it's like, why bother? It's kind of my message.
Right. Okay. If anybody has any other questions, let me know. We have one other question here. Are you able to support a briefing to our broader teams on this issue? And if so, who are the right people to involve in that conversation?
Yeah, so we generally see there's a mix of resource. There's application security engineering, if you have that as a function. If you have a governance risk and compliance function, they're definitely involved in the conversation. It may be IT or cyber, depending upon how you have things structured. You may have departmental level people that need to be involved. Web management, that kind of thing. It usually becomes, sort of a group project, but not like a disruptive one, just at least to kind of navigate through what needs to be done. Who are the people that need to be, engaged and aware of what's going on? Campus Guard can help you with that in terms of identifying the right resource. We can help you with that as well. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, we take our role in the educational process here really serious, and so we're happy to do a lot, to help you understand what's going on with no strings attached.
Okay, great. That's all the questions we have. So, Steve, just want to say thank you so much for your insightful presentation and to
Sure.
all of our attendees for participating in today's webinar. Just a quick reminder, please take a brief survey, which launches right after this session has ended. If you have any questions you think of later and you want to reach out to us or you're interested in a demo, please let us know. And yeah, have a great rest of your day, everybody. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everybody.